The courtroom in Kingsford County was filled with low murmurs as the case began. All eyes were on the 19-year-old standing at the defense table, Nathaniel Carter. Dressed in an ill-fitting shirt and worn sneakers, he hardly looked the part of someone in a legal battle. His hands nervously clutched a stack of papers, the edges curling from his grip. The gallery, unsure of what to make of him, exchanged amused glances. At the bench sat Judge Gloria Matthews, a figure known for her strict, no-nonsense approach. She scanned Nathaniel quickly before returning to the file in front of her. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice sharp, "you do realize that the court doesn't take kindly to individuals showing up unprepared, don't you?" A faint laugh rippled through the courtroom. Nathaniel's face flushed, but he steadied himself. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand," he replied, his voice unwavering despite the gallery's reactions. Judge Matthews leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Very well. Proceed, Mr. Carter. Let's see what you've got." The case seemed straightforward. A minor speeding violation. Nathaniel was representing himself, which seemed odd to most in the room. The opposing attorney, Michael Sullivan, was a seasoned professional, certain this would be a quick win. He glanced at Nathaniel with a mix of pity and confidence. Nathaniel cleared his throat and began. "Your Honor, I am here today to contest a speeding ticket, but I believe the evidence presented is flawed." He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. The officer who issued the ticket didn't have the proper equipment or positioning to accurately determine my speed. The room fell silent, and even Judge Matthews looked up from her notes, intrigued. Nathaniel continued, outlining the details of the incident: timing, road conditions, the officer's position. Michael Sullivan shifted in his seat. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, raising a hand. "This is irrelevant." Nathaniel didn't flinch. "With all due respect, it's highly relevant. According to Section 4152 of the Vehicle Code, a radar reading cannot be used unless the officer is in the correct position and the equipment is calibrated properly. Neither condition was met." Judge Matthews raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. She wasn't used to hearing such precise arguments from someone so young. The gallery, which had once been dismissive, was now silent, listening intently. Nathaniel wasn't just defending himself, he was making a strong case. Sullivan, now on the defensive, stood and argued. "The statute is irrelevant to this case, Your Honor. The ticket should stand." Nathaniel didn't back down. He motioned to the table, where he had laid out a simple hand-drawn diagram. "This diagram shows why the officer's position made the radar reading inaccurate," he said, pointing to the drawing. "The officer's equipment could have easily misread the speed, especially given the weather conditions." Judge Matthews blinked, clearly caught off guard. She hadn't expected this level of preparation from the young man, who had looked like a nervous teenager just moments ago. Even Sullivan, who had initially dismissed Nathaniel, seemed to pause, unsure of how to respond. Nathaniel turned back to the judge. "Without a calibrated radar gun and a proper reading, the evidence cannot be trusted. I request that this case be dismissed." The room was still. Judge Matthews studied him for a moment before speaking. "You've done your homework, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice softer than before. "Where did you learn all of this?" Nathaniel met her gaze steadily. "I've been studying law for years, Your Honor. I passed the bar exam last year." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. A 19-year-old licensed attorney? The opposing counsel, Michael Sullivan, seemed speechless for a moment. "You passed the bar exam?" Sullivan asked, incredulous. Nathaniel nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been studying law since I was 13. Judge Matthews' stern expression shifted slightly. She had underestimated him, but now she was listening and respecting what he had to say. The courtroom fell into an unexpected silence as Nathaniel Carter stood before the judge, his calm demeanor now commanding the room's attention. Gone were the murmurs and chuckles that had greeted him when he first entered. Even Judge Matthews, known for her sternness, seemed to be paying closer attention. "Mr. Carter," Judge Matthews said, her tone still sharp, "you've raised an interesting point about the radar gun's calibration. Do you have any supporting evidence for these claims?" Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He pulled a neatly organized folder from the table and laid out several documents for the court to see. A weather report showing the heavy rain that day, a map of the location, and an expert's testimony on radar calibration. The officer was positioned at a distance where the radar reading wouldn't have been accurate, especially considering the weather conditions. Nathaniel explained, radar guns can be unreliable in heavy rain, and this expert report supports that. There was a noticeable shift in the room. The gallery, once amused by his youthful appearance, was now captivated. Even Michael Sullivan, the opposing counsel, appeared uneasy. Sullivan stood up, trying to maintain his composure. "Your Honor," he said, his voice wavering slightly, "this expert testimony is irrelevant. There's no reason to believe the officer's radar reading was flawed." Nathaniel calmly replied, "With all due respect, counselor, without proper calibration records, the radar's accuracy is in question. The law requires more than just assumptions. It requires proof." Sullivan's face reddened and he faltered. I don't have that documentation with me," he admitted, his frustration clear. "But the officer has used the radar many times before. It's routine." Judge Matthews' gaze sharpened. "Routine isn't enough," she said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. She turned back to Nathaniel. "Mr. Carter, would you like to continue?" Nathaniel nodded, his voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. The law isn't about routine, it's about fairness. If the evidence is unreliable, then the case must be dismissed." He turned to face Sullivan directly. "Can you confirm that the radar gun was calibrated that day?" Nathaniel asked, his tone firm. Sullivan stammered, unable to provide an answer. "I don't have that paperwork, Your Honor," he said again, more defensively now. "But it's standard procedure." Nathaniel's voice remained unwavering. "Standard isn't enough. The law requires proof. Without it, this evidence is inadmissible." The gallery was now fully silent, the weight of Nathaniel's words hanging in the air. Judge Matthews glanced at the documents before her, her expression now thoughtful. She turned to the opposing counsel, who was visibly rattled. "You're claiming this is a routine procedure, Mr. Sullivan," Judge Matthews said, her tone skeptical. "But that's not sufficient in a case where someone's rights are at stake. Without proper documentation, this case can't proceed." Sullivan opened his mouth to respond, but his voice faltered. Nathaniel had successfully dismantled the core of the prosecution's argument. Judge Matthews turned her attention back to Nathaniel. "You've made a compelling argument, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice quieter now, tinged with a newfound respect. "You've certainly made me reconsider my initial judgment." Nathaniel felt a sense of validation, but he stayed focused. This was just the beginning. He wasn't here to prove anyone wrong. He was here to ensure fairness. Judge Matthews leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "Mr. Carter, you've raised valid concerns. The court will take this into consideration before rendering a decision." The courtroom remained still, the tension palpable. Sullivan had no further rebuttal, and Nathaniel knew he had done what he came to do. The room was no longer filled with the skepticism and doubt that had greeted him earlier. It was now filled with something else: respect. As the proceedings continued, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Nathaniel Carter stood with a quiet confidence that no one had expected from a 19-year-old. The gallery was no longer snickering or eyeing him with amusement. They were listening, watching, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Judge Matthews, her stern expression softening slightly, looked over the papers Nathaniel had presented. She had been a judge for over 2 decades, and she prided herself on being able to read people. But Nathaniel was different. She wasn't sure what to make of him, but she knew one thing: he wasn't the inexperienced kid they had all assumed. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice now steady and measured, "you've raised some important points, but let's make sure we're not overlooking something. The officer did issue a ticket, and there is a report. What's your response to that?" Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "Your Honor," he began, his tone respectful but firm, "I don't dispute that the officer issued the ticket or that the report was filed. What I'm disputing is the accuracy of the evidence behind the ticket. Without reliable evidence, a ticket doesn't hold up in court, and we haven't seen any proof that the officer followed proper procedures." There was a murmur in the gallery. For the first time since the trial began, it wasn't one of dismissal, it was one of curiosity. The opposing attorney, Michael Sullivan, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Nathaniel wasn't backing down. He was pushing forward with a precision that was almost unnerving. Judge Matthews tapped her pen against the desk, considering Nathaniel's words. "So you're suggesting that because the evidence is unreliable, the case should be dismissed?" Nathaniel nodded, his eyes unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution has not shown that the radar gun was properly calibrated or that the officer followed correct procedures in issuing the ticket. In the absence of clear evidence, the case cannot continue." Sullivan jumped to his feet, his frustration finally spilling over. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The officer is highly trained. This is just a technicality. The defendant's argument is based on nothing more than speculation." Nathaniel turned to face Sullivan. "With all due respect, Counselor, the law doesn't run on assumptions. It runs on facts. And without facts, there is no case." His words cut through the air like a knife, precise and clear. The courtroom fell silent again. The spectators, who had been murmuring quietly throughout the session, now held their breath. Even Judge Matthews seemed to be considering the implications of Nathaniel's argument. For the first time since the trial began, it was clear. She was no longer just a neutral observer. She was engaged. Judge Matthews took a moment, leaning back in her chair, her fingers steepled in thought. She glanced at Sullivan, who was visibly sweating, then at Nathaniel, who stood calmly awaiting her response. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Carter, I have to admit, you've caught my attention. You've done something few attorneys, especially first-year ones, can do. You've convinced me to reconsider my initial stance." Nathaniel's heart raced, but his face remained composed. He had done it. He had made his case. But this was just one step in a much longer journey. "Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady, "I'm not here to win points. I'm here to ensure that the law is followed. If the evidence isn't reliable, it shouldn't be used to convict anyone." The room was still. The air was thick with anticipation, and for a brief moment, Nathaniel allowed himself a small breath. His confidence had grown with every passing second. He wasn't the naive kid that had walked into this courtroom hours earlier. He was a force to be reckoned with, and everyone in the room knew it. Judge Matthews' gaze softened, a hint of respect breaking through her usually stoic demeanor. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I think I've heard enough. I'll review the evidence and make my decision." The opposing counsel had no more words. Sullivan sat back down, defeated, while Nathaniel stood tall, knowing that no matter what happened next, he had already won something far more important than the case. He had earned the respect of everyone in that room. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Judge Matthews returned from her chambers, where she had been reviewing the evidence presented by Nathaniel. Her steps were deliberate, her expression unreadable. Nathaniel stood at the defense table, his hands steady at his sides, though his heart was pounding in his chest. It wasn't over yet, but he had a sense that something was shifting. The opposing attorney, Michael Sullivan, had long since stopped trying to mount a rebuttal. The case, which had seemed like a simple traffic dispute just hours earlier, had evolved into a much bigger battle, one about fairness, due process, and the integrity of the evidence. Nathaniel knew he had made his mark, but would the judge see it the same way? Judge Matthews settled back into her seat at the bench, her gavel in hand. The gallery was completely still, each spectator waiting for her decision. Nathaniel caught a glimpse of a few faces in the crowd, some nodding in silent approval, others leaning forward with bated breath. "Mr. Carter," Judge Matthews began, her voice calm yet authoritative, "you've made a compelling argument today, one that has forced me to reconsider the evidence presented in this case. In all my years on the bench, I've seen countless defendants, but rarely have I seen someone so young, so prepared, and so unwavering in their pursuit of justice." Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. Had she just said what he thought she had? He forced himself to remain composed, meeting her gaze with the same confidence that had carried him through the entire trial. Judge Matthews continued, her voice carrying weight in the room. "The prosecution has failed to provide adequate evidence to support the claims made in this case. As such, I find the radar evidence inadmissible, and I am granting the motion to dismiss the charges against Mr. Carter." A beat of silence passed, then a ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Some were gasping in disbelief, while others were nodding in recognition of what had just occurred. Even Sullivan, the seasoned attorney who had dismissed Nathaniel earlier, had no words left. He simply stood there, his face red with frustration. Nathaniel couldn't believe it. The weight of the decision seemed to sink in slowly. He had won. Trieste is not just the case, but something far greater. The respect of those in the courtroom who had initially doubted him. "Court is adjourned," Judge Matthews said, her gavel ringing in the silence. As the crowd began to disperse, Nathaniel remained standing by the defense table, his mind racing. The finality of it hadn't fully set in yet, but the moment had arrived. It was a victory, a moment he would never forget. He could hear the whispers of the gallery, some of awe, others of disbelief, wondering how a teenager had just taken down a seasoned prosecutor with nothing but determination and an unparalleled grasp of the law. A few moments later, the bailiff approached Nathaniel. "Mr. Carter," he said with a nod, "Judge Matthews has requested to speak with you in her chambers." Nathaniel nodded, his mind still reeling. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he had the feeling that this conversation would be significant. He followed the bailiff down the hallway to Judge Matthews' private chambers, a quiet confidence settling in him. This was the moment where everything could change. When they entered the chambers, Judge Matthews was sitting at her desk, her gaze still thoughtful. She gestured for Nathaniel to take a seat across from her. "Mr. Carter," she began, her tone softer now, "I've been a judge for many years, and I've seen my fair share of young defendants come through this courtroom. But you are something different." Nathaniel shifted slightly, surprised by the recognition in her voice. "Your Honor," he said, unsure of where the conversation was going, "I just did what I thought was right. I wasn't here to prove anyone wrong." Judge Matthews leaned back in her chair, her expression reflective. "You've done more than just prove a legal point today. You've reminded me of why I became a judge in the first place, to ensure that fairness and justice prevail, regardless of one's age, appearance, or background." Nathaniel met her gaze, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to feel a sense of relief. He hadn't just won the case, he had challenged the assumptions of an entire system that so often overlooked people like him. Judge Matthews nodded as if coming to a decision. "Mr. Carter, you've shown a depth of understanding and commitment that most seasoned attorneys would envy. I believe you have a bright future ahead of you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Nathaniel was taken aback. The respect she was showing him was more than he had ever hoped for when he first walked into that courtroom. He smiled, his voice steady. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means more than you know." As he left the chambers, the weight of the day's events slowly began to sink in. Nathaniel Carter, the 19-year-old kid who had walked into the courtroom alone, had just won a landmark victory, one that would change his life forever. The journey was just beginning, but he knew one thing for certain: he was ready. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Nathaniel. His name was now known across the country, and everywhere he went, there seemed to be someone who recognized him. At first, it was overwhelming. He had never imagined that defending himself in a simple traffic case would lead to nationwide attention. But despite the flashing cameras and the questions from reporters, Nathaniel remained grounded. He didn't seek the spotlight. He simply wanted to ensure that his victory, in a way, would help others who had been overlooked or underestimated. The viral video of his final argument had spread like wildfire across social media, with millions of views and countless comments from people inspired by his calm, articulate defense. The story of a 19-year-old law enthusiast standing up against an experienced prosecutor struck a chord with people, not just in the legal world, but across various industries. Some hailed him as a symbol of perseverance, others as proof that age and appearance should never be the deciding factor in one's potential. One afternoon, as Nathaniel sat in his modest apartment, his phone buzzed with a new notification. It was from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" he said, his voice steady. "Mr. Carter," came the voice on the other end. "This is George Hargrove from Hargrove and Williams Law Firm. We'd like to discuss a potential internship opportunity with you. After watching your performance in court, I believe you could make a significant impact in the legal field. We'd like to meet with you and explore how we can work together." Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. He had dreamed of being part of a prestigious firm one day, but this was faster than he had anticipated. "I'd be honored, Mr. Hargrove. I'm available to meet anytime." In the following days, Nathaniel met with several law firms, all eager to bring him on board as an intern. The offers were overwhelming, but he remained focused on his long-term goals: to learn, grow, and advocate for justice in a way that was both fair and impactful. He didn't want to rush into anything. After all, this wasn't about fame, it was about making a difference. At the same time, his mother Lorraine was watching the media coverage with mixed emotions. She was proud of Nathaniel, immensely proud, but she also knew the world could be harsh. She worried that people might only see him as a novelty, a story rather than a person. But when she saw the way her son handled the attention, with humility and grace, her fears began to ease. One evening, as Nathaniel walked into the living room after a long day, Lorraine looked at him with a soft smile. "You've made quite a name for yourself," she said, pulling him into a hug. "But remember, it's the work you do in the quiet moments that will define you, not the headlines." Nathaniel nodded, his heart full of gratitude. "I know, Mom. I just hope I can help others like me. People who don't fit the mold, but have something to offer. I want to prove that brilliance doesn't come with a label." A few months later, Nathaniel sat in a lecture hall at a prestigious law school. The room was filled with students from all walks of life, some of them older, some with years of experience under their belts. But Nathaniel stood out. He wasn't just another aspiring lawyer. He was someone who had already earned his place in the courtroom. Professor Mark Whitley, a seasoned attorney and teacher, began his lecture with a nod toward Nathaniel. "We have a special guest today, someone who knows what it means to stand up for fairness in a system that often judges too quickly. Mr. Carter, would you like to share your story with the class?" Nathaniel stood, his nerves momentarily flaring before he regained his composure. The students were looking at him with curiosity, respect, and awe. He cleared his throat, then spoke with the same steady voice that had carried him through his entire journey. "I didn't walk into that courtroom to prove anyone wrong. I walked in to prove myself right. I'm not here to be the exception. I'm here to show that anyone can rise above the doubts others place on them. No matter where you come from, what you look like, or how old you are, if you have the passion and the preparation, you can do anything." The room was silent for a moment before a slow round of applause erupted, and Nathaniel felt a wave of humility wash over him. He had come so far, from the uncertain teenager walking into that courtroom to the young man standing in front of his peers, offering hope and wisdom. As he left the classroom later that day, Nathaniel knew this was just the beginning. He wasn't done yet. He had so much more to learn, so much more to give. But he was on the path he had always dreamed of, a path that was no longer defined by others' expectations, but by his own. Nathaniel Carter's story became more than just a viral sensation. It became a testament to the power of determination, humility, and the courage to defy expectations. He continued to rise through the ranks of the legal profession, eventually becoming a respected attorney known for his commitment to justice and his ability to challenge the status quo. In the years that followed, he became a mentor to many young aspiring lawyers, particularly those who felt that they didn't belong or that their backgrounds or appearance would limit their opportunities. Nathaniel's legacy was not built on fame. It was built on the belief that every individual, regardless of their circumstances, had the potential to change the world. And as for Judge Matthews, she often looked back on that case as a turning point in her career. Nathaniel had reminded her, in a way that few ever could, of the importance of keeping an open mind and not allowing bias to cloud one's judgment. She had, in fact, become an advocate for younger, underrepresented lawyers, seeing in them the same spark that had once shone brightly in Nathaniel. In the end, Nathaniel Carter's journey wasn't just about winning a case. It was about rewriting the rules for what success looks like and showing the world that no one should ever be underestimated.